If you still think the Federal Reserve printing money is an abstract macro story that lives far away from your real life, you are already too late, because money printing is not abstract once it enters the room. It is not an academic debate. It is not a chart for economic students. It is not a policy footnote. It is a machine. And once that machine starts again, it does not stop at Washington. It moves through Treasury auctions. It moves through bond yields. It moves through mortgages. It moves through your savings account. It moves through food, fuel, insurance, rent, and the quiet shrinking of everything your paycheck can still buy. That is the first thing I want you to understand. What matters is not whether they call it quantitative easing or reserve management or balance sheet adjustment or any other polished phrase designed to keep ordinary people asleep. What matters is whether new money is being created to absorb debt that the real market does not want to absorb at the old price. If that is happening, then the machine is on. And right now, the machine is on. The source you gave me says the Federal Reserve's balance sheet rose from about $6.155 trillion at the end of 2025 to roughly $6.271 trillion by the 25th of March, with the bulk of the increase flowing into Treasury bills and some into Treasury notes and bonds. It argues that in net terms about $120 billion was created over roughly 3 months, while much larger gross purchases of Treasuries were partially offset by reductions elsewhere. Then it makes the crucial point the Fed is stepping in because there are not enough willing buyers of U.S. government debt at yields low enough for the government to tolerate. It also says M2 money supply growth for February was running around 10.6%, while official CPI was being presented around 2.4%, and that inflation pressures were already re-accelerating before further financial deterioration required larger intervention. That is the core structure I am preserving. Faithfulosite Fay turn 78 file 0 Fay, but I do not want to talk about this the way policy people talk about it. I want to talk about it the way a serious allocator should talk about it. I call it the dilution engine, because that is what it is. A machine that solves one problem in the short run by thinning the value of the currency in the long run. A machine that exists because the debt burden has become too large for the bond market to finance, honestly at politically acceptable rates. A machine that pretends to be technical management, when in fact it is a transfer mechanism. It transfers pressure out of the debt market. It transfers pain into the currency. It transfers purchasing power away from savers. It transfers advantage toward people who own the right assets and away from people who trust the wrong promises. That is the engine. And if you do not understand how it runs, you will spend the next few years watching your nominal balances sit there while your real life quietly gets more expensive, tighter, and less negotiable. The first chamber in the dilution engine is what I call the buyer shortage. This is where the polite lie ends. Governments like to pretend they borrow because the world is thrilled to lend to them. Sometimes that is partly true, right? Now, it is less true than the public is being encouraged to believe. The source says the Fed bought roughly $148 billion more in Treasury bills and another $33 billion more in notes and bonds over the period it reviewed. And it makes the logic brutally simple. If enough private investors, institutions, and foreign countries wanted to lend to the U.S. government at the current rates, the Fed would not need to step in this way. The fact that it is stepping in tells you something the headlines keep trying to soften. Demand is not strong enough at the price the system wants. Fay file site Fay turn 78 file 0 Fay. This is not a minor detail. It is because the real issue is not that the government has debt. The real issue is that it has debt at a scale where honest market clearing becomes politically dangerous. If the market were allowed to clear naturally, then when buyers were reluctant, yields would have to rise until enough people said yes. That is how price works. But the U.S. government is carrying around $39 trillion of debt, according to the source. And once debt is that large, even modest increases in financing costs start eating the state from the inside. So the system cannot easily allow a fully honest market in its own borrowing costs. It needs a managed one. It needs a buyer of last resort. It needs the Fed. That is the buyer shortage. Not that nobody wants Treasuries, that not enough buyers want them at the rates the system can safely tolerate. And once that happens, the dilution engine starts because there are only two real options left. Either allow yields to rise and let the debt service burden become more toxic, or create new money and absorb the debt indirectly. The public is told there are many subtle options. There are not. There are only versions of those two. The second chamber is what I call the Treasury funnel. This is where most people lose the plot because they imagine the newly created money being scattered vaguely into the economy like confetti. It is not that random. It moves through a channel. The source spells this out clearly. Newly created money is being used to buy Treasury bills, notes, and bonds. The language around those purchases may vary depending on maturity and program, but the substance is unchanged. New base money is being directed into government debt. That means the first destination of the new money is not your pocket. It is the federal funding mechanism. The government gets finance, the system gets temporary relief, the immediate funding pressure softens, then the money works its way outward through spending, rollover support, financial stability measures, and the asset markets connected to that support. Fay file site Fay turn 78 file 0 Fay. That is why I call it the Treasury funnel. Because the money is not being created for beauty. It is being funneled into a financing problem. The government needs a market for its debt. The market is not sufficiently cooperative. So the central bank becomes the marginal support. That matters because it destroys one of the most comforting myths in modern finance, which is that there is a clean line between monetary policy and fiscal survival. There is no clean line anymore. Not when the debt stock is this large, not when yields rise this fast, not when inflation is still unstable, not when every major part of the system, from banks to commercial real estate to private credit, is already sensitive to the cost of money. In that environment, Treasury management becomes monetary management, and monetary management becomes a form of political triage. That is a much dirtier world than the public likes to imagine, and dirty systems almost always choose dilution over open collapse, at least until dilution itself creates the next crisis. The third chamber is what I call the yield ceiling. This is where people say something that sounds intelligent and is actually naive. They say, if inflation is a problem, then just raise rates or keep them high. That statement only makes sense in a system that can afford the medicine. The source's logic is blunt here and correct in its structure. If buyers are reluctant, Treasury yields would have to rise to attract them. But if yields rise too much, the government's interest burden gets more unbearable. That is why the Fed is stepping in. The state cannot honestly tolerate the full market price of its own debt if that price rises enough. And now look at the bond market, the source highlights. The 30-year yield is under pressure. The 10-year yield matters because mortgage rates are anchored to it. Mortgage rates moved up from roughly 6.0% to 6.6% over about a month, and the source is telling. That is not a minor move in family life. That is the difference between a payment that fits and one that does not. Fay file site Fay turn 78 file 0 Fay, that is the yield ceiling. Not a formal cap declared in public, a functional cap created by debt intolerance. If yields rise too much, the Treasury hurts, mortgage markets hurt, housing hurts, banks with duration exposure hurt, commercial real estate hurts, private credit hurts, and the political system discovers very quickly that it does not actually want honest rates. It wants survivable rates. There is a world of difference between those two. This is why I do not laugh when people say the Fed's hands are tied. They are tied not by ethics, by arithmetic. If inflation is reaccelerating, you cannot cut aggressively without feeding it. If the debt market is weakening, you cannot let yields rise without feeding a different fire. If you are trying to protect both the currency and the debt structure at once, you eventually discover that one of them has to take the pain. And in the modern fiat world, the currency usually gets volunteered for the job. That is what the dilution engine really is. It is the decision to sacrifice some long-term purchasing power in order to avoid immediate structural rupture. The fourth chamber is what I call the inflation echo. This is where the public gets fooled again and again. They think money printing and inflation move together on a clean schedule. Print on Monday, prices rise on Tuesday. Everyone claps or panics on Wednesday. That is not how it works. It moves through lags, it moves through asset channels, it moves through financing channels, it moves through expectations, it moves through substitution, and scarcity and inventory behavior. Then it returns. That is why I use the word echo. The source says official CPI was around 2.4%, but argues that this figure badly understates the actual price dynamic in points, instead to M2 growth running at 10.6%. I do not need to adopt every rhetorical flourish in the source to respect the deeper point. Monetary expansion and cost of living experience are not the same measurement, but they are linked over time. A system that is creating money to absorb debt while its structural inflation pressures remain unresolved is laying the groundwork for more future price pressure. Even if the official narrative stays calm for a while, Fe turn 78 file 0 Fe, that is the inflation echo. The policy action happens first. The full social cost comes later. And because it comes later, the public keeps getting talked into complacency. They are shown one index, one CPI print, one seasonal adjustment, one comforting explanation. Meanwhile, the real economy keeps doing something else. Insurance moves, food moves, housing, related costs move, energy moves, service pricing hardens, and slowly the family notices that even when their income has not collapsed, their flexibility has. That is inflation in the form that matters, not the television number, the loss of room. The fifth chamber is what I call the mortgage wire. This one matters because the middle class always finds out last that macro policy has entered the house. They still think it is out there somewhere, in some marble building argued over by people in better suits. Then the 10-year yield moves, then mortgage rates move, then the house they thought they could almost afford becomes absurd. Then the refinance dream dies. Then the home builder slows down. Then the existing owner refuses to move because he is locked into a rate from another world. Then supply tightens while affordability worsens. And now the entire housing ladder turns hostile. The source says clearly that the 10-year Treasury yield is very important because mortgage rates correlate with it, and that the move in that yield helped push 30-year fixed rates from roughly 6.0% to 6.6%. That may look like a technical change to someone staring at bond screens. To a family, it is a regime change. Same income, same ambition, same house, entirely different monthly reality. Fe turn 78 file 0 Fe, that is the mortgage wire, a direct transmission line from the bond market to the middle class dream. And the dangerous part is not just the level. It is the instability. A society can adjust painfully to one stable environment. What it cannot easily handle is a financing structure that keeps repricing against ordinary families, while wages, savings, and planning habits were built in a different cost world. That is why I keep telling people that housing pain is not just about home prices. It is about the price of permission. The permission to buy, the permission to move, the permission to refinance, the permission to stay in the game at all. And once the mortgage wire turns hostile, the middle class stops climbing and starts defending. That is when a society gets meaner. The sixth chamber is what I call the Fed cage. This is where the story becomes genuinely ugly because all the obvious moves are bad. The source points to the 29th of April meeting, then June, July, September, and says market probabilities heavily favored, no cuts at each stage. It even suggests that a token cut from incoming leadership could be too far. Fetched if conditions remain this strained. Again, the exact meeting path is less important than the structural point. If inflation is accelerating and the bond market is weak, the Fed cannot cut freely. But if private credit, commercial real estate, banks, and sovereign funding all need relief, the Fed also cannot remain permanently passive. That is the cage Fe turn 78 file 0 Fe. A trapped Fed is not a powerful Fed. It is a rationing Fed. A choosing which pain Fed. Do you want more inflation? Do you want more yield pressure? Do you want more housing stress? Do you want more banking fragility? Do you want more debt rollover risk? Do you want more purchasing power loss? Pick one, or rather, pick which one you want first. That is what a cage feels like. And once you understand that, you stop waiting for the central bank to make your life easy again. You start asking how to build a life that survives whichever pain gets chosen. That is a much more adult question. The seventh chamber is what I call the real asset escape. This is where the source points somewhat forcefully, and where I think the deeper logic deserves careful handling. The source ends by saying fiat currencies continue to devalue and that real assets continue to go up in price over the long term, warning people not to be left behind. I do not need to turn this into a sales pitch for any particular asset to say the principle is serious. If the state solves a debt funding problem by creating more money and softening the currency over time, then claims purely denominated in that currency are living on a diet of hidden deterioration. The more direct your exposure is to paper promises without yield or protection, the more you absorb the damage. Real assets, productive assets, scarce assets, short duration yield instruments that keep pace better, and businesses with pricing power all deserve a different level of attention in that world. Fay file a site, Fay turn 78 file 0 Fay. This is what most people get backward. They think the point is to predict the exact week the Fed pivots or the exact month inflation prints hotter. That is not the point. The point is to recognize which regime you are in. A dilution regime rewards people differently from a stable money regime. A dilution regime punishes cash, sitting dead and checking. It punishes long-duration nominal promises more than people expect. It punishes lazy thinking about purchasing power. It rewards people who understand the difference between nominal stability and real stability. That is the escape, not panic. Regime recognition. Now, I want to talk about the identity shift, because that is where most people either evolve or stay trapped. The old identity is the saver who trusts the nominal screen. He sees a balance. He sees a paycheck. He sees a mortgage rate. Quote, he sees a CPI number. He assumes the visible labels describe the real system. That identity is now too weak. You need to become a purchasing power allocator. That means you stop asking, how much money do I have? And start asking, what will this money still command in 5 years if the dilution engine keeps running? You stop asking, is my savings account safe? And start asking, is this yield protecting me or politely destroying me? You stop asking, will rates go down soon? And start asking, what parts of my life break if they do not? That is the shift. From nominal thinker to real thinker. From account holder to allocator. From policy spectator to regime reader. Until you make that shift, you will keep mistaking printed comfort for actual safety, and that mistake gets very expensive when the machine runs for years instead of months. Now, let me give you the operating protocol I would use if I were speaking to a household that wanted defense, not drama first. I would classify every meaningful financial asset by dilution exposure, zero yield checking cash, savings yields below inflation, long duration bonds, mortgage sensitivity, rate-sensitive growth stocks, businesses with pricing power, real assets, precious metals, short, duration Treasury instruments. You cannot defend what you have not classified. Second, I would treat every liability in my life as a rate bet. If a debt only works for me if rates fall soon, then I am already living too close to the machine. Third, I would move emergency reserves out of dead cash and into structures that at least fight for positive real yield where possible. Exactly as the source suggests with high yield savings and short duration Treasury type instruments. Fourth, I would stop calling nominal gains real gains. If your portfolio rises 6% in a world where the real cost structure rises faster or where the currency loses more ground, your celebration is premature. Fifth, I would reduce dependence on any single policy outcome. The most fragile household right now is the one built on the idea that one cut, one rescue, one calm inflation report, one market rally, or one political transition will restore the old world. That is fantasy. You do not build serious resilience on fantasy. Now I want to say the difficult part plainly. The public is being trained to accept dilution as normal, quietly, technically, respectably, not with dramatic slogans, with phrases like reserve management, temporary support, stable funding conditions, orderly market functioning, or whatever the next euphemism will be. But the machine does not care what it is called. Your grocery bill does not care. Your housing cost does not care. Your retirement purchasing power does not care. Names are there to protect the institution. Effects are what hit the household. So here is the final mirror I want you to stand in front of. If the dilution engine is already back on, what in your life is still built for a stable money world? Your cash, your bond exposure, your mortgage assumptions, your retirement math, your belief that the government can borrow without consequence, because someone will always step in. Your faith that one official inflation number is enough to describe what your life is really costing. Are you still living like a passenger on a machine you do not understand? Or are you willing to become the allocator your future now requires? Will you keep trusting nominal balances? Or will you start fighting for real value? Will you keep waiting for rates to save you? Or will you build a life that stops needing a benevolent rate environment to remain intact? That is the real divide, not bull or bear, not optimistic or pessimistic, protected or diluted. And if I were writing a contract with my future self tonight, it would say this: I will not let polite language hide the fact that money is being created to relieve a debt burden the real market will not finance honestly. I will not confuse nominal stability with purchasing power safety. I will classify my assets by exposure to the dilution engine. I will reduce the parts of my life that only work if rates magically fall and inflation stays behaved. I will defend my reserves against silent erosion. I will remember that when the system chooses between open rupture and slow currency damage, it usually chooses the damage that is harder for ordinary people to describe, because that damage lasts longer. And the people who come through it best are not the ones who understand the jargon. They are the ones who understood the machine. Be one of them.